The Morning Majority on 630 WMAL.
707 on WMAL. Brian Neiman, along with Peter Marisi, University of Maryland economist, on the show this morning. Good to have you, Peter.
Nice to be with you, Brian.
We've got Scott Cleland coming up in the 8 o'clock hour. I'll talk to him 1 hour from now. He's the author of the book Search and Destroy, Why You Can't Trust Google.
Can't trust Google. Who can you trust?
I don't know.
I mean, it's like you're telling me mom betrayed you.
Can't trust Arnold Schwarzenegger.
That's for sure.
The other day.
I mean, everybody thought Arnold was the ultimate governor.
Yeah.
He was.
Can't trust Iran. We know that.
Well, we always knew that, Brian. I mean, wasn't there a list of subjects I gave you that you should stay out of?
That's right. Yeah,
that was
I did.
On the list. Places you shouldn't visit on vacation.
I failed to do my homework.
That's right.
I
gave you a reading
lax,
assignment, and that's why we don't do blue books here.
That's right. We're everything. KT McFarland having a tough time connecting with her. I do want to talk to you, since you're here, about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. First of all, before we get into Dominique Strauss-Kahn, DSK, what the hell is the International Monetary Fund anyway?
We would all like to know that. The International Monetary Fund was established at the end of World War II along with the World Bank and what was the predecessors to the WTO to manage the system of exchange rates, these currency rates between countries.
All right, that makes
Back
sense.
in those days, we had a fixed exchange rate system. It was fixed, and you had to sort of try to maintain it. That went out of existence during the Carter years. Mm-hmm. And since that time, the IMF has evolved into the role of making short-term lending to countries that get in trouble, like read Greece, okay, and soon the United States. Mm-hmm. And it does a lot of monitoring of countries' monetary policies and fiscal policies, and this monitoring is considered important. And it's been doing a lot of monitoring of China, for example, saying, China should revalue its currency and stop cheating and all this. Now, interesting enough, the deal has always been that the Americans get the presidency of the World Bank,
right,
which makes long-term development loans to poor countries, and the Europeans get the president of or the director of the IMF, and then we get the deputies on the opposite side. Okay. Well, now the Chinese and the Asians are saying, "Hey, wait a minute.
What about us?
What about us? After all, we're richer than you guys are now." So, the Chinese are pushing one of their own. Now, if the Asians can coalesce around a candidate, something the Europeans always have lots of trouble doing, then they might actually get the top spot or the number 2 spot, which will mean that the rule breakers will now become the rule makers. This is not a symbolic thing. The IMF has been calling the Chinese to task on their currency cheating, something that both Republican and Democratic administrations here, agree on is a problem.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, if they're going to take over the organization that does the monitoring, I mean, why don't we put the criminals in charge of the penitentiary?
Yeah, all right. And then you have countries like Brazil as well and India who are saying the same. They're the more developing countries, the upper economy.
One of the problems that we have is the ultimate task of the IMF is exchange rates. And virtually all these countries have played games with their currencies over the year. If you can figure out the Indian exchange rate system, it's kind of like a unified field theory problem in physics.
Yeah, get the CIA to do that. KT McFarland's on the phone now. I'm Fox News national security analyst. Good morning, KT.
Good morning.
We're talking about trust in Iran. I do want to first start off with this new guy, the interim leader of al-Qaeda, who they say, Saif al-Adel, who apparently was one of the founding fathers of al-Qaeda and went into Iran in like 2002, captured by the Iranians and kept on, quote, house arrest, but he's now no longer in Iran. How big of a concern is that to us?
I think that there's several ways to think about it. One, I'm concerned about the growing Iran-al-Qaeda connection. This guy's from Iran. Osama bin Laden had stashed some of his family in Iran after September 11th. We've talked about it in the past and sort of suspected maybe there was a connection. Mm-hmm. I think there probably is a growing connection. And Iran may try to exploit the situation and the uncertainty and the sort of succession crisis in al-Qaeda to try to get its hands on that international movement. Iran remains one of the world's biggest, the biggest sponsor of state sponsor of terrorism in the world.
Is there any concern that Iran gave this guy some tips before they let him go into Waziristan or
sort
wherever
of
he
a
went to?
do-it-yourself bomb kit?
Well, you mean like nuclear?
Yeah.
I don't. My guess is that Iran wants to hang on to that stuff pretty much and have operational control itself over those kinds of weapons, if they even have them. I don't think they have a nuclear weapon yet, although they are happily on their way. The other thing, though, I think is important about al-Qaeda is that they are going to be in a succession crisis. This guy is temporary. There seems to be a succession issue of, two guys competing with each other, this guy and al-Zawahiri. Neither of them are popular. Neither of them are charismatic. Neither of them probably have the ability ultimately to reknit the al-Qaeda international network or to fundraise. So I think that al-Qaeda is going to go through a succession era, and neither of these two guys will probably be the final leader if there is one. And I think that so al-Qaeda has been diminished and weakened in the sense that it's not that unified, strong structure that we now know through that treasure trove of information. We now know that Osama bin Laden really was still calling the shots. But secondly, I think that they will try, either the franchises or al-Qaeda Prime, will try to do some, get their hands on weapons of mass destruction and do something big to show the world they're still relevant.
All right. Also in that treasure trove of information, one thing that caught my attention was that bin Laden was apparently cheering the Arab Spring because he saw it as an opportunity to replace these governments with,
his kind of government.
Yeah.
Here's the thing about the Arab Spring is it's putting all this region into play. The old model of autocratic dictators who don't provide for their people, they're all being brushed aside one way or another. The question is what replaces them. Does what replace them is a pro-Western, secular, self-governance of some sort, democracy, or what replaces them is an Islamist state, a Muslim Brotherhood, a Taliban kind of state. And we don't know. It could flip either way.
Of course, it could also go a third way. We could have a restoration of the old regime like post-Napoleonic Europe.
You could do that temporarily, but the problems remain in that kind of a scenario, which is, the problems of large demographic problems, large youth population with no economic prospects. That remains no matter what kind of government you have.
That's true. Even if you have a democratic government, one of the things is democracy really can't deliver economic development for these people.
It can't immediately, but it probably holds the best prospect of economic development over any of the other systems.
Ask the Chinese about that.
You mean a benevolent dictatorship?
Well, that's what they're selling the world. That autocracy provides order. If it's benevolent, that it can move things along much more rapidly than look at the problems that we're having.
Yeah, but the whole Chinese model is one that's a benevolent dictatorship centered on economic development. I don't think you can say Osama bin Laden is centered
of course
on any
not.
kind of economic.
No, but
these guys want to bring it back to the 14th century.
No, and also the Chinese, frankly, had assets at their disposal that, say, a dictator in Egypt would not have. One of the things that people grossly underestimate is the importance of the overseas Chinese population and the fact that family was seen going 5 generations. That gave them access to distribution systems in the West to launch those early labor-intensive products, the toys, the T-shirts, things of that nature, to get things going.
But the other thing I think of any of these countries, and even going back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, as a Russian once explained to me, he said before television and before mass communications, we in Russia, all we did was look at our lives compared to what our parents had. So if our parents were in Stalingrad or Leningrad during the war and they had nothing and people were dying of starvation, he said, our lives look pretty good in the 1970s, but by 1980s, we started getting television from the West. Radio Free Europe really did penetrate, and he said that one of the first shows he ever saw was Dallas. Remember J.R. Ewing?
Yeah.
And all those guys
good
with
wholesome
big cars,
family
big
man.
hats, and and the women with big hair.
We're talking with KT McFarland, Fox News national security analyst. All right, so the president gives another big speech today on the Middle East. What do you expect him to say? What do you hope that he says?
Well, a couple of things. First, with his speech, he should first do no harm, as doctors say. Don't offer to topple leaders. Don't say you got to go. Don't try to get involved militarily in somebody else's civil war like we did in Libya, which has turned out to be a disaster. Do what America's really good at. Offer economic assistance. Offer, aid to education. Those are the things that we're good at, the countries we've done them in. We predominantly did that during the Cold War, and that was phenomenally successful.
And what about Syria and the new language against Bashar Assad? The Syrians aren't too happy about that. Where do you see that going today?
Yeah, name and shame. Particularly the Syrian leadership. If any ladies in your listening audience still have Vogue from last month, go look at the article about Mrs. Assad. It was a puff piece designed to make her look, sort of like a combination of Princess Di and the Queen.
Right.
They really wanted international recognition. They really wanted to be seen as the reformers. They've shown that it's just the opposite. So I think that not only sanctioning them financially and sanctioning Assad personally, but showing the world that these guys are real. They're murderers and thugs. They're not good guys and reformers. I think that's extremely important. But don't talk about we're going to topple him and we're going to go in and do this and do that. Use what America's good at, economic sanctions and economic assistance. And I keep looking at Pakistan, and I keep thinking, Jesus, if we hadn't given Pakistan all that financial, all the assistance, the $20 billion we've given to Pakistan since September 11th, it's almost all been military assistance that they've in fact funneled, frankly, into the Taliban and into their nuclear weapons program. But if we had given them at least a dollop of that had been financial, economic assistance and schools. Give them schools. The only schools in Pakistan are private schools which nobody can afford, or madrasas which teach terrorism. Had we gone in there and built 500 schools, I think we'd see a very different Pakistan today. So do that in that part of the world. Because, as I said, these countries are all going to change, and they're either going to go in self-governing, democratic, capitalist, secular direction, or they're going to go in the bad guy direction and do what we're good at and try to encourage them to go in the good guy direction.
Secretary Gates said that essentially he believes someone in Pakistan knew that bin Laden was hiding there, but he did say that there's evidence to the contrary that nobody high up in the government knew. Is there any?
That's plausible deniability.
But is there any significance to him publicly stating that, or just?
Yeah, he's saying that we know what you know, and you now know that we know it. I talked to one Pakistani journalist who's from that region, and he said right across the street, like 100 yards away from the bin Laden compound, was a building built within the last several years, a compound of an Army major, active-duty Army major, so wears the uniform. He's a medical doctor, and he's a kidney specialist. And in his compound were 2 towers, which are illegal in Abbottabad, 2 towers built to overlook the Osama bin Laden compound. So, come on, somebody knew. And to me, that's a safe. They gave him a safe house. Now, why? Why would they tell us they were after bin Laden, and then on one hand, and then on the other hand, keep him alive? Because they're in the bin Laden finding business. As long as bin Laden is alive and a threat and shaking his fist at America, they can go to America and say, give us military assistance, build us a military so we can go find...
It's a jobs program?
This is what we call economic development, Pakistani style.
Oh, that's great. That makes me feel better. KT, great to have you on the show as always. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
KT McFarland, Fox News National Security Analyst here on WMAL.